I moved into my new apartment in early October last year. It wasn't anything special, just a small one-bedroom place on the third floor of an older building on the edge of town. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was quiet, and honestly, it felt like the perfect place to start over after college. For the first couple of days, everything was completely normal. The building itself was pretty quiet. Most of the tenants seemed older, and I rarely saw anyone in the hallways except for one person. My new neighbor. He lived directly across the hall from me. The first time I saw him was the night I moved in. I was carrying the last box from my car when I noticed his apartment door slowly opening. Just a few inches. A man stepped halfway into the hallway. He looked to be in his mid-40s. Tall, thin, pale. His hair was messy like he had just woken up. But what stood out the most was the way he was staring at me. Not just a quick glance. He was studying me, like he was trying to memorize my face. I gave him a small nod and said, "Hey." He didn't respond. He just kept staring for another few seconds, then slowly closed his door. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Some people are just awkward. But looking back, that was the first moment something felt slightly off. A few days went by and I settled into my routine, work during the day, gaming, or watching YouTube at night. But that's when I started noticing something strange. Almost every night around 11 p.m., I would hear the neighbor's door open. The hallway outside my apartment had very thin walls, so sounds carried pretty easily. At first, it sounded normal. East door opens, footsteps in the hallway, then the elevator. But after a few nights, something about it started to feel wrong, because the footsteps would stop right outside my door and just stay there. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for the elevator. But the elevator was at the other end of the hallway, which meant he was just standing there, right outside my apartment, doing nothing. The first time I noticed it, I just ignored it. The second time, it felt a little weird. But by the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore, because the footsteps stopped outside my door again. And this time, they didn't move for almost a full minute. No walking, no elevator, just silence. Like someone was standing completely still, right outside my door. I slowly paused my TV and just listened. My entire apartment went quiet. And then, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A very soft sound, right near my door handle, like someone lightly touching it, testing it. Very slowly, very carefully. I sat there frozen on my couch, staring at the door, not moving, not breathing. After about 10 seconds, the footsteps finally walked away. The elevator dinged, and everything went silent again.
Shh, did you
I
hear
told
that?
myself it was nothing. Maybe he leaned against the door by accident. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But the next night, it happened again. And this time, it got worse. The next night, I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I mean, it's an apartment building. People walk through hallways all the time. Still, around 10:45 p.m., I found myself checking the clock more than usual. Because part of me was waiting to see if it would happen again. 11:02 p.m., right on time. I heard the same sound. The neighbor's door slowly opening. The hallway was quiet enough that I could hear the hinges faintly creak through my door. Then, footsteps. Slow ones. Not rushed. Not normal walking. Just slow, deliberate steps. And like the previous nights, they stopped right outside my door. My chest tightened immediately. I muted my TV again and sat completely still. This time, I decided to check. My apartment door had a small peephole. I stood up quietly and walked toward the door as slowly as I could. The footsteps outside hadn't moved, which meant he was still there, right outside. I leaned forward and looked through the peephole, and what I saw made my stomach twist. The man was standing there, facing my door, completely still. His head slightly tilted down, like he was staring directly at the handle. He wasn't knocking, he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching my door. I must have stared through the peephole for 10 seconds before something even stranger happened. He slowly lifted his head and looked directly into the peephole, like he knew I was watching him. I jumped back instantly. My heart started pounding. There was no way that was a coincidence. He couldn't have known I was standing there, right? For a few seconds, I just stood there frozen in my living room. Then finally, I heard the footsteps again, walking away. The elevator dinged, and the hallway went silent. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he heard the floor creak when I walked to the door. Maybe he just looked up randomly. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right, and things only got worse from there. Because 2 nights later, something happened that made it impossible to ignore. It was around midnight when I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they didn't stop outside my door. They walked past it, which honestly made me feel relieved. But then, about 30 seconds later, I heard something else. A very faint sound, right next to my bedroom wall. Now my bedroom shared a wall with the neighbor's apartment. At first it sounded like scratching. Very light, like someone dragging something across the wall. I sat up in bed and listened carefully. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It continued for almost 20 seconds. Then suddenly, it stopped. I waited. Everything was silent again. Then I heard something that made my entire body go cold. A quiet voice, coming from the other side of the wall. It was so faint I almost couldn't make out the words. But after a few seconds, I realized something horrifying. The man was talking, and he wasn't talking to someone else. He was whispering, right against the wall, and the words sounded like this: "I know you're in there." I froze. My heart felt like it dropped into my stomach. There was no way that was random, no way, because the wall he was whispering into was directly behind my bed. I didn't move for almost a full minute. Then suddenly, 3 slow knocks echoed through the wall. Knock, knock, knock. And that's when I realized something. Something that made the entire situation even more terrifying. Because those knocks were exactly where my head had been resting against the wall. Almost like he knew where I was sleeping. I didn't sleep at all that night. After those 3 knocks on the wall, I just sat there in bed, staring into the darkness of my room. Every sound in the apartment suddenly felt louder. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock in the kitchen. Even my own breathing felt too loud. I kept thinking about what he said. "I know you're in there." And the way he knocked exactly where my head had been. It didn't feel random. It felt intentional, like he had been watching me somehow. The next morning, I decided I needed to get out of the apartment for a while. I grabbed coffee from a place down the street and tried to clear my head. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. How could he possibly know where I was in the room? Unless he could see inside my apartment, and that thought stuck with me the entire day. And later that evening, when I got back home, I decided to check something. My bedroom wall. I moved my bed slightly away from it and turned on the flashlight on my phone. At first, everything looked normal. Plain white wall, no damage, no cracks. But when I leaned closer, I noticed something small. Something I definitely hadn't seen before. A tiny dark circle in the wall, barely bigger than the tip of a pencil. At first, I thought it was just a nail hole. But when I moved the flashlight closer, I felt my stomach drop. Because the hole wasn't empty. There was something inside it. Something reflective. Like glass. And then it hit me. A camera lens. Someone had drilled a tiny hole through the wall and placed a small camera inside it, pointing directly into my bedroom, right where my bed was. For a few seconds, I couldn't even process what I was looking at. My hands started shaking, because that meant he hadn't just been listening through the wall. He had been watching me for who knows how long. I immediately grabbed my phone and stepped into the hallway, and that's when I saw something that made everything even worse. His apartment door was slightly open, just a few inches, and inside, I could see multiple screens glowing in the dark, like computer monitors. I stood there frozen, staring at the crack in the door. Part of me wanted to run, but another part of me needed to know. I slowly walked closer and gently pushed the door open a little more. And what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There were cameras everywhere, tiny ones mounted on walls, yet pointing at different parts of the building. And right in the middle of the room, 3 monitors. One showing the building hallway, one showing the parking lot, and the third one, my bedroom, from that tiny hole in the wall. My bed was right there on the screen, exactly where I had been sleeping every night. I felt sick. I stepped back immediately and pulled out my phone to call the police. But before I could dial, I heard something behind me, a door opening, slowly, right across the hallway. I turned around, and the neighbor was standing there, just like the first day I met him. Tall, pale, expressionless. But this time, he was smiling. A slow, unsettling smile. He looked directly at me, then at the open door to his apartment. And calmly said, "You weren't supposed to see that." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he took one step toward me. That's when my body finally reacted. I ran, straight to the stairwell at the end of the hall. I didn't even wait for the elevator. I just kept running down the stairs until I reached the lobby and burst outside. I called the police immediately. They arrived about 10 minutes later, but by the time they checked his apartment, he was gone. The cameras were still there, the monitors were still on, but the neighbor had completely disappeared. No one in the building even knew his real name. He had only moved in 2 months before me, and according to the landlord, he had paid everything in cash. I moved out of that apartment the very next week, and for months after that, I kept thinking about something. Saw something that still makes me uncomfortable even now. Because when the police showed me the footage from those cameras, they told me something strange. The camera inside my wall had been recording for weeks, which meant the neighbor had been watching me every night, long before I ever noticed him standing outside my door.